The sun sank low over the rugged horizon of Montana Territory, painting the vast sky in shades of amber and crimson, as Elijah Harlow lifted the last wooden beam into place for the new stable. Blood from his blistered hands stained the timber, but physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache that had settled in his chest 3 years ago, an ache he'd learned to live with like an old bullet wound that never quite healed. It was 1878, and at 32 years old, Elijah had already lived several lifetimes' worth of joy and sorrow. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm and stepped back to examine his work. The Double Cross Ranch was slowly coming back to life under his calloused hands, though the same couldn't be said for its owner. "Looks sturdy enough to withstand the next decade of Montana winters," said Samuel Wilson, his neighbor from the adjacent property. The older man handed Elijah a canteen of water, which he accepted with a grateful nod. "That's the plan," Elijah replied, his voice rough from disuse. He'd grown accustomed to the solitude, to the quiet company of horses and cattle, to the language of the land that didn't demand pleasantries or small talk. Samuel cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to another. "Listen, Harlow, the town's organizing a social next Saturday. Thought you might want to know." Elijah handed the canteen back without meeting the man's eyes. "Appreciate it, but I've got fence posts to mend on the north pasture." "Been 3 years, son," Samuel said carefully. "Margaret wouldn't want. I know what Margaret would want," Elijah cut him off, his voice hardening. "And it doesn't matter. She's gone." He picked up his hammer and turned away, a clear dismissal that Samuel wisely heeded. As the sound of Samuel's horse faded into the distance, Elijah drove nails into wood with unnecessary force. Margaret, his wife, his heart, taken by a fever that swept through the valley like wildfire, claiming 6 lives in its wake, their unborn child with her. In the aftermath, he'd made a vow to her memory, to himself, to whatever God might still be listening, that he would never love again. The risk was too great, the potential loss too devastating. Once was enough for any man. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, promising another scorching summer day. Elijah was up before first light, as always, tending to his horses and preparing for a day's work of cattle driving. He had 20 head to move to the higher pastures where the grass remained green despite the season's drought. He was just saddling his stallion, Thunderbolt, when he heard the approaching sound of hoofbeats. Visitors were rare at the Double Cross, and rarely welcome. Elijah's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip as he stepped out of the stable into the pale morning light. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of not 1, but 3 riders. As they drew closer, Elijah recognized Sheriff Thomas Jenkins in the lead, followed by 2 strangers, a man in a smart suit that marked him as a city dweller, and a woman whose face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "Morning, Harlow," the sheriff called out, reining his horse to a stop. "Hope we're not intruding too early." Elijah nodded curtly. "Sheriff, what brings you out this way?" The sheriff dismounted, followed by his companions. "This here is Mr. Lawrence Parker from Boston and his sister, Miss Beatrice Newcombe. They've had some trouble on the road to Helena, and they need a place to stay for a few days." Elijah's jaw tightened. "The town's only 5 miles south, plenty of rooms at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house." "Ordinarily, I'd agree with you," the sheriff said, lowering his voice. "But there's been word of Road Agent Roberts and his gang in the area. Miss Newcombe had a run-in with them yesterday, lost their driver and most of their belongings. Your place is remote enough and defensible, just until I can arrange proper escort to Helena." Before Elijah could object, the woman stepped forward and removed her hat. Sunlight caught in her auburn hair, illuminating it like burnished copper. Her face was delicate but strong, with high cheekbones and clear blue eyes that met his without wavering. "Mr. Harlow," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I understand this is an imposition, and I wouldn't ask if there were any other option. We can compensate you for your trouble, of course." Something in her direct gaze made the words of refusal die in Elijah's throat. He looked away, uncomfortable with the sudden awareness of his unkempt appearance and the stark simplicity of his homestead. "I don't have proper accommodations for a lady," he said gruffly. "I assure you, Mr. Harlow, I've endured far worse than rustic accommodations these past few days," she replied with unexpected humor in her voice. "A roof and relative safety are all I require." Her brother Lawrence stepped forward. "We truly appreciate any assistance, sir." "It would only be for a few days." Elijah looked to the sheriff, who gave a small nod. With a resigned sigh, Elijah gestured toward the house. "You can take the main bedroom. I'll sleep in the barn." "That won't be necessary," Beatrice insisted. "We wouldn't displace you from your own home." "It's settled," Elijah said firmly, turning away. "Sheriff, I need to move cattle today. Can you help them get settled?" Without waiting for an answer, he mounted Thunderbolt and rode off toward the cattle pens, cursing under his breath. 3 years of carefully constructed solitude, shattered by strangers who would bring nothing but disruption to his ordered existence. By the time Elijah returned in the late afternoon, the sun was beginning its descent, and the aroma of cooking food greeted him as he approached the house, an unfamiliar sensation that stopped him in his tracks. Through the window, he could see Beatrice moving about his kitchen, her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back with a simple ribbon. He hesitated on the porch, suddenly reluctant to enter his own home. The domesticity of the scene before him stirred memories best left buried. Margaret humming as she prepared supper. The plans they'd made for children to fill the rooms with laughter, the future that had died with her. The door opened before he could retreat, and Beatrice stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. "Mr. Harlow," she said with a small smile, "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of preparing supper. It seemed the least I could do." Elijah removed his hat, acutely aware of the dust and grime of the day's work. "You didn't have to do that, Miss Newcombe." "Beatrice, please," she corrected him. "And I wanted to. Lawrence's resting the journey was particularly hard on him. He's not accustomed to such rigorous travel." Elijah nodded, uncertain how to respond to her kindness. "I should wash up. Of course, supper will be ready shortly." The meal was surprisingly good, a simple stew with biscuits that somehow tasted better than anything Elijah had eaten in years. They ate mostly in silence, with Lawrence making occasional attempts at conversation that Elijah answered with minimal responses. "Mr. Parker mentioned you're headed to Helena," Elijah finally said, if only to divert attention from himself. "Family there," Lawrence shook his head. "Business opportunities. After our father passed last winter, we decided a fresh start was in order. I've arranged to purchase interest in a mercantile." "And you, Miss Newcombe?" Elijah found himself asking, despite his better judgment. "What brings a Boston lady to Montana territory?" Beatrice met his gaze steadily. "Adventure, Mr. Harlow, and perhaps the chance to define myself away from Boston society's rather narrow expectations of unmarried women of a certain age." There was a flash of something in her eyes, determination, perhaps, or defiance, that caught Elijah's attention. At closer inspection, he realized she was older than he'd initially thought, perhaps in her late 20s, though still possessing a youthful vibrancy that made her seem younger. "Montana's not kind to the unprepared," he warned. "It's not Boston drawing rooms and garden parties." A smile curved her lips. No, it's certainly not. That's precisely why I'm here. After supper, Elijah excused himself to sleep in the barn as planned, ignoring Lawrence's protests. The simple task of making a bed in the hayloft was comforting in its familiarity, a retreat into routine after the unsettling presence of guests in his home. He lay awake longer than usual, listening to the soft nickering of horses below and the distant howl of a coyote. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him, his mind replaying fragments of conversation, the sound of Beatrice's laughter when her brother recounted a mishap from their journey, the way her hands moved as she spoke. Elijah rolled onto his side, angry with himself. It meant nothing. She was a temporary disruption, nothing more. In a few days she would be gone, and his life would return to its solitary rhythm. That was for the best. It had to be. Dawn found him already at work, splitting wood with methodical precision. The repetitive motion was soothing lift, position, swing, split, stack. Again and again, working up a sweat despite the early hour. He was so absorbed in the task that he didn't notice Beatrice's approach until she spoke. "You're up early," she observed, holding out a cup of coffee. Elijah paused mid-swing and lowered the axe. He accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, aware of how she studied his homestead with interest. "Beautiful land you have here," she said, gesturing to the sweeping vista of mountains beyond his property. "How long have you been here?" 5 years, he replied, taking a sip of the coffee stronger than he usually made it, but good. "Built most of it myself." "It shows," she said with genuine admiration. "There's character in things built by hand. My father used to say you could tell a lot about a man by what he creates." Elijah didn't know how to respond to that, so he changed the subject. "Your brother's still sleeping?" "Yes," Beatrice sighed. "Lawrence has many fine qualities, but early rising isn't among them. May I ask what your plans are for today? Perhaps I could be of some assistance." Elijah almost declined out of habit, but something, perhaps the earnestness in her expression, made him reconsider. "I need to check the southern creek for any cattle that might have wandered down there," he said. "The drought's got them searching for water anywhere they can find it." "Could I accompany you?" she asked, and when he hesitated, she added, "I've been cooped up in stage coaches and hotel rooms for weeks. Some fresh air would do me good." Against his better judgment, Elijah found himself nodding. "Can you ride?" Her smile was answer enough. "My father insisted all his children learn, regardless of gender. It scandalized my mother's friends to no end." An hour later, they rode side by side across the rolling grasslands, Beatrice sitting confidently astride a gentle mare named Daisy. She wore a divided riding skirt that Elijah suspected was scandalous by Boston standards, but practical for frontier life. Her hair was braided and pinned up beneath her hat, with a few copper strands escaping to frame her face. "You handle yourself well on a horse," Elijah observed as they descended a gentle slope toward the creek bed. "Thank you," she replied. "Though I admit Daisy is far more docile than the spirited mounts I was accustomed to in Massachusetts. Father bred racehorses as a hobby." "And yet you're trading that life for a frontier town." Beatrice was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "After Father died, there wasn't much left for me in Boston. Lawrence received the bulk of the estate as is customary. There was a modest trust for me, but—" She paused. Let's just say the suitors who had previously shown interest suddenly became quite earnest when my financial situation became known. Elijah glanced at her, surprised by her candor. "I apologize," she said quickly. "That was inappropriately forthcoming of me." "No," Elijah replied. "Out here, people tend to speak plainly. It's refreshing." They reached the creek, which was little more than a trickle in most places due to the drought. As expected, several head of cattle had gathered at one of the few remaining pools. Elijah dismounted to check on a young heifer that seemed to be favoring one leg. "Is she injured?" Beatrice asked, dismounting as well. "Looks like she stepped in a gopher hole," Elijah replied, running his hands carefully over the animal's leg. "Nothing broken, but she sprained it good." "What will you do?" "Get her back to the barn, let her rest it." He straightened up, calculating the logistics of moving an injured animal across rough terrain. "I'll help," Beatrice offered, reading his thoughts. "Between the two of us, we can guide her back slowly." Elijah studied her for a moment. "It'll be slow going, might take most of the day." "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Harlow." "Elijah," he said suddenly, "if we're going to spend the day herding an injured cow, you might as well use my given name." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Elijah, then." The journey back was indeed slow, but Beatrice proved to be both patient and resourceful. When the heifer balked at crossing a dry wash, she calmly removed her jacket, using it to block the animal's peripheral vision until it moved forward. When they stopped to rest in the shade of a lone cottonwood, she produced a small bundle of biscuits she'd thought to bring along. "You've done this before," Elijah observed as they shared the simple meal. Beatrice laughed softly. "Not exactly this, but I spent summers at my grandfather's farm in Vermont. He believed idle hands were the devil's workshop and put everyone to work, regardless of age or gender." "Your grandfather sounds like a sensible man." "He was," she said, a wistful note in her voice. "He taught me that worth isn't measured by social standing or appearances, but by one's actions and character." She brushed crumbs from her skirt. "I think he would have approved of the frontier. There's an honesty to life here that Boston society lacks." Elijah found himself watching the way the dappled sunlight played across her features as she spoke, the animation in her expressions. It had been so long since he'd had a real conversation with anyone, let alone a woman. The realization was unsettling. "We should get moving," he said abruptly, standing up. "Want to get back before dark." They arrived at the ranch as the sun was setting, guiding the injured heifer into the barn. Lawrence was on the porch, his expression a mixture of relief and irritation. "Beatrice, I've been worried sick," he exclaimed. "You left only a vague note about riding out with Mr. Harlow." "I'm perfectly fine, Lawrence," she replied calmly, dismounting with Elijah's assistance. Her hand rested briefly on his arm as she steadied herself, the simple contact sending an unexpected jolt through him. "We were helping an injured animal." Lawrence's gaze shifted between them, clearly not entirely appeased. "Next time, please be more specific about your whereabouts and expected return." "Your sister was a great help today," Elijah said, feeling strangely compelled to defend her. "She has a good way with animals." Beatrice glanced at him, surprise and gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, but I merely followed your lead." That evening, after tending to the horses and the injured heifer, Elijah found himself lingering in the barn longer than necessary. The thought of returning to the house, of sitting across from Beatrice at the supper table, listening to her voice, watching her movements, it stirred something in him that he'd long thought dead. Something dangerous. When he finally entered the house, he found Lawrence asleep in a chair by the fire, a book open on his lap. Beatrice was alone in the kitchen, washing dishes. "You should have waited," Elijah said, uncomfortable with the sight of her doing his chores. "I would have done that." "Nonsense," she replied without turning around. "You've worked all day. Besides, I enjoy having tasks to accomplish. Makes me feel useful." Elijah moved to stand beside her, picking up a towel to dry the dishes she'd washed. They worked in silence for a few moments, the domestic intimacy of the scene not lost on him. "The sheriff rode by while you were in the barn," Beatrice said finally. "He says the road to Helena should be safe to travel the day after tomorrow. He'll escort us himself." Elijah nodded, ignoring the unexpected twinge of disappointment. "That's good news for you and your brother." Beatrice placed the last plate on the stack and dried her hands. "Yes," she said softly, though there was a note in her voice he couldn't quite interpret. She turned to face him, standing closer than was proper. "Elijah, I want to thank you for your hospitality. I know our presence has disrupted your routine." "It's nothing," he said gruffly, acutely aware of her proximity, of the scent of lavender that clung to her skin. She studied him for a moment, her blue eyes searching his face as if looking for something specific. "May I ask you something personal?" Every instinct told him to refuse, to maintain the distance he'd so carefully cultivated. Instead, he heard himself say, "You can ask." "The sheriff mentioned you lost your wife. I'm very sorry." It wasn't exactly a question, but Elijah felt the familiar constriction in his chest at the mention of Margaret. 3 years ago, fever took her and our unborn child. Compassion, not pity, filled Beatrice's eyes. "I lost my fiancée to tuberculosis 6 years ago. I understand something of that kind of grief." The revelation surprised him. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. She nodded, her gaze dropping briefly to her hands, where no ring adorned her fingers. "Time dulls the sharpest edges of loss, but I don't think certain wounds ever fully heal. They become part of who we are." The simple truth of her words resonated with him in a way that all the well-intentioned platitudes never had. For the first time in 3 years, Elijah felt truly seen. "Well," Beatrice said, breaking the moment with a small smile, "I should see if I can rouse Lawrence enough to get him properly to bed." "Good night, Elijah." "Good night," he replied, watching as she crossed to her brother's chair. That night, as he lay in the barn loft, sleep once again eluded Elijah. His mind kept returning to the conversation in the kitchen, to the understanding in Beatrice's eyes. She knew. Not the specifics of his pain, perhaps, but its nature, its depth. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. He rose before dawn the next morning, determined to busy himself with enough work to silence the unwelcome thoughts. There was fence mending to be done, and he set out to the north pasture, with tools and materials loaded onto Thunderbolt. The repetitive physical labor usually cleared his mind, but today it failed to provide its usual relief. As he hammered new posts into the hard ground, his thoughts kept drifting back to the house, to Beatrice, to the way her face had looked in the golden light of sunset as they'd returned from their ride. "Fool," he muttered to himself. "She'll be gone tomorrow, back to her own life." By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising a summer thunderstorm. Elijah hurried to finish the section of fence he was working on, but the first fat raindrops began to fall before he could complete it. Within minutes, the sky opened up, drenching him as he gathered his tools. He was riding back to the ranch, rain streaming down his face, when he spotted a figure near the creek. Beatrice, seemingly caught in the downpour. She was struggling with something in her arms, and as he drew closer he realized it was a lamb, one of the orphans he'd been hand-raising. "What are you doing out here?" he shouted over the rain, dismounting quickly. "The lamb got out," she called back. "I was walking by the pen when I saw it slip through a gap in the fence. I couldn't let it wander off in this weather." Her dress was soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, but her arms cradled the lamb protectively. Elijah took off his duster and wrapped it around both her and the animal. "Come on," he said, leading her to Thunderbolt. "Let's get you both back before you catch your death." He lifted her onto the horse, handed her the lamb, and swung up behind her. The closeness was unavoidable, his chest pressed against her back, one arm around her waist to steady her as Thunderbolt picked his way carefully through the muddy terrain. Elijah could feel her shivering against him despite the duster. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. "I didn't think the storm would hit so quickly." "Montana weather," he replied, his breath stirring her wet hair. "Changes faster than a card sharp's luck." When they reached the barn, Lawrence came running out from the house, his face a mask of concern. "Beatrice, good Lord, what happened?" "She rescued a lamb," Elijah explained as he helped her dismount. "Got caught in the storm." Lawrence immediately took charge, ushering his sister toward the house. "Come inside this instant. You need dry clothes and hot tea before you fall ill." Elijah watched them go, then turned to care for Thunderbolt and the lamb. By the time he'd settled both animals and changed into the only other dry shirt he owned, the storm had intensified into a full-blown tempest, with lightning splitting the sky and thunder shaking the very ground. He made his way to the house, knowing he couldn't spend the night in the barn with lightning striking so close. As he entered, he found Lawrence pacing the main room. "Mr. Harlow," he said, clearly agitated, "I fear my sister is developing a fever. She's burning up despite changing into dry clothes." Alarm shot through Elijah. "Where is she?" "In the bedroom. I've given her some willow bark tea," but Elijah didn't wait to hear the rest, striding quickly to the bedroom door. After a brief knock, he entered to find Beatrice propped up against pillows, her face flushed, her eyes unnaturally bright. "Elijah," she said, her voice weaker than he'd ever heard it, "I'm sorry to cause such trouble." He moved to the bedside, placing a hand on her forehead. She was indeed burning with fever. Memories of Margaret's last days surged through him, the same flushed cheeks, the same bright eyes, the same heat radiating from her skin. "No," he said, more to himself than to her. "Not again." "It's probably just a chill from the rain," Beatrice said, trying to sound reassuring despite her obvious discomfort. Elijah turned to Lawrence, who hovered anxiously in the doorway. "There's a chest in the pantry with medical supplies. Bring it here." As Lawrence hurried to comply, Elijah sat on the edge of the bed. "How do you feel, truthfully?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," she admitted with a weak smile. "My head is pounding, and I can't seem to get warm despite feeling like I'm burning up." Elijah's jaw clenched. The symptoms were all too familiar, all too terrifying. Lawrence returned with the chest, and Elijah retrieved a bottle of quinine and some powdered herbs that the local Crow medicine woman had given him, a mixture he'd acquired too late to save Margaret but had kept nonetheless. "I need to prepare this," he told Lawrence. "Stay with her." In the kitchen, Elijah worked with focused intensity, boiling water and preparing the herbal remedy with precise measurements. His hands were steady even as his mind raced with fear. Not again. He couldn't watch another woman die under his roof, consumed by fever. When he returned to the bedroom, Beatrice was shivering violently despite the blankets piled on her. Lawrence sat beside her, holding her hand, his expression haunted. "She's getting worse," he said, looking up at Elijah with desperation. "We need a doctor." "Nearest doctor's in Helena," Elijah replied, setting down the cup of medicine. "No one's riding in this storm, and even if they could, it would take too long." He moved to Beatrice's side. "Help me prop her up so she can drink this." Together, they managed to get Beatrice upright enough to sip the bitter medicine. She grimaced at the taste but drank it all, her trust in him evident despite her suffering. "What now?" Lawrence asked as they eased her back against the pillows. "We wait," Elijah said grimly, "and we pray." The night stretched endlessly as the storm raged outside and Beatrice's fever burned within. Elijah sent Lawrence to rest in the other room after the man nearly collapsed from exhaustion, promising to wake him if there was any change. Alone with Beatrice, Elijah maintained his vigil, regularly replacing the cool cloth on her forehead and administering more medicine when needed. In her delirium, she murmured incoherently, occasionally calling out for her father or someone named James, her lost fiancé, Elijah presumed. Each time, he would take her hand and speak softly until she quieted. As midnight passed and the storm began to abate, Beatrice's fever still raged. Elijah found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 years, praying, earnestly and desperately, to a God he'd come to resent. "Please," he whispered, holding her limp hand between his calloused ones. "Not her too." Near dawn, Beatrice's fever finally broke. Elijah, dozing in the chair beside her bed, woke to find her watching him through clear, if exhausted, eyes. "You stayed," she said softly. Relief flooded through him with such intensity that for a moment he couldn't speak. He simply nodded, still holding her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "I feel as though I've been on a long, strange journey." "You had us worried," he admitted, his voice rough with fatigue. "Us." A small smile played at her lips despite her weakness. "Your brother's asleep in the other room. He sat with you until he could barely keep his eyes open." Elijah realized he was still holding her hand and gently placed it back on the coverlet. "I should let him know you're better." As he stood to go, Beatrice's voice stopped him. "Elijah, would you mind? Would you hold my hand again, just for a moment?" It was comforting. The request, so simple and yet so profound, froze him in place. In that moment, the enormity of what was happening struck him with perfect clarity. The wall he'd built around his heart, the vow he'd made, they were crumbling before this woman who'd stormed into his life as suddenly as the tempest that had now passed. Slowly, he sat back down and took her hand in his. Her fingers curled weakly around his, warm now rather than burning with fever. "Just once," she said with that same small smile. "I won't ask again." But in the depth of her eyes, in the gentle pressure of her hand in his, Elijah recognized the truth. This moment was not an ending but a beginning. And despite the fear that still gripped him, he couldn't bring himself to let go. The following days passed in a blur of recovery and delayed departures. The storm had washed out portions of the road to Helena, making travel impossible until repairs could be made. Sheriff Jenkins rode out to inform them it would be at least a week before the route was passable. Beatrice regained her strength gradually, each day able to venture a little farther from her sick bed. Elijah found himself watching for her appearance each morning, the sight of her seated at his kitchen table or walking slowly in the garden becoming a comfort rather than an intrusion. They fell into an unexpected routine. Elijah would complete his morning chores, then return to the house where Beatrice would have coffee waiting. Often, they would sit on the porch, talking as the sun climbed higher in the summer sky. She told him of her childhood in Boston, of her dreams for a new life in Montana. He, to his own surprise, found himself sharing stories of his early days on the ranch, of the struggles and triumphs that had shaped his life here. Lawrence, for his part, spent much of his time reading or writing letters to business contacts in Helena, seemingly content to leave his sister in Elijah's company as long as her health continued to improve. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of purple and gold, Beatrice turned to Elijah with a thoughtful expression. "May I ask you something that might seem impertinent?" she said. Elijah nodded, having grown accustomed to her direct manner of speaking. "That night when I was ill, you said something. I'm not sure if I dreamed it or if it was real." She paused, her eyes searching his face. "You said not her too. Were you thinking of your wife?" The question caught him off guard, but he found himself answering honestly. "Yes, Margaret. She died very much the way you almost did. Fever that came on suddenly, burned through her like wildfire." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. I couldn't save her. Beatrice was quiet for a moment, then said softly, I don't think you could have saved me either if it had been my time. But you tried. That matters. Does it? The question escaped him before he could stop it, raw with the doubt that had plagued him for 3 years. Yes, she said with quiet certainty. It does. When James was dying, I would have given anything for one more day, one more hour with him. Your wife knew you were there, fighting for her until the end. There's comfort in that, even in the face of death. Elijah looked at her then, really looked at her not as an unwelcome guest or a reminder of his past, but as a woman who had faced her own grief and emerged still capable of compassion, of wisdom, of connection. You're a remarkable woman, Beatrice Newcombe, he said simply. A blush colored her cheeks, visible even in the fading light. Hardly remarkable, just someone who has learned that life rarely follows the paths we expect it to. She smiled then, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Much like finding myself stranded on a remote ranch with a taciturn cowboy who turned out to be not nearly as intimidating as he first appeared. Elijah found himself chuckling, the sound rusty but real. Is that so? And here I thought I was maintaining a properly fearsome demeanor. Oh, you tried, she teased. But then you rescued lambs in rainstorms and sat up all night with sick houseguests. Rather ruins the effect. Their laughter mingled in the evening air, and something in Elijah's chest loosened a tightness he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't natural. The next morning, Sheriff Jenkins returned with news that the road repairs were progressing faster than expected. Should be passable by day after tomorrow, he announced after accepting a cup of coffee from Beatrice. I can escort you and your brother to Helena then, Miss Newcombe. That's wonderful news, Lawrence said, looking up from his book. We've imposed on Mr. Harlow's hospitality far too long already. Elijah, who had been repairing a bridle at the kitchen table, kept his eyes fixed on his work, ignoring the sudden hollowness in his stomach at the thought of their departure. Yes, of course, Beatrice said after a moment, her voice carefully neutral. We're very grateful for the update, Sheriff. Later that day, as Elijah was checking the injured heifer's progress, he heard Beatrice's approach before he saw her. He'd grown attuned to the sound of her footsteps, the rustle of her skirts against the grass. She's healing well, Beatrice observed, coming to stand beside him at the pen. Another week and she'll be good as new. Seems so, Elijah agreed, straightening up. Animals are resilient that way. As are people, she said, turning to face him directly. Elijah, I need to ask you something, and I would appreciate an honest answer, regardless of what it might be. The seriousness of her tone made him give her his full attention. All right. Beatrice took a deep breath. When Lawrence and I leave for Helena, would it be unwelcome if I were to write to you, or perhaps visit when circumstances allowed? The question hung between them, weightier than its simple words suggested. Elijah knew what she was really asking. Was there something between them worth pursuing, worth nurturing beyond these unexpected days of forced proximity? 3 weeks ago, the answer would have been simple, automatic, final. Now, looking into her eyes, seeing the mix of hope and apprehension there, he found himself at a crossroads he'd never expected to face again. I made a vow, he said slowly, after Margaret died, that I would never love again, that I couldn't bear that kind of loss a second time. Disappointment flickered across Beatrice's face, though she tried to hide it. I understand. I shouldn't have presumed. Let me finish, he said gently. I made that vow because I was drowning in grief, because I couldn't imagine ever feeling anything again except pain. But these past days with you, he paused, searching for the right words. You asked to hold my hand just once, and I found I didn't want to let go. Hope returned to her eyes, cautious but unmistakable. "What are you saying, Elijah?" "I'm saying that I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I can be the man you deserve." He took a step closer to her. "But I'd like the chance to find out. So yes, write to me. Visit when you can. I'll be here." The smile that bloomed on Beatrice's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then that's where I'll start. With letters and visits, and we'll see where the path leads." Elijah reached out, taking her hand in his. This time it wasn't about comfort or fever or momentary connection. It was a beginning, tentative and fragile but real. "I'd like that," he said simply. The day of departure dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers across the ranch. Lawrence supervised the loading of their few belongings onto Sheriff Jenkins' wagon, while Beatrice said her goodbyes to the animals she'd come to know: Daisy, the gentle mare, the orphaned lamb she'd rescued, even the injured heifer who now came to the fence when she approached. Elijah watched from a distance, allowing her these moments, storing away the image of her moving through his world as if she belonged there. When she finally turned toward him, her face was composed but her eyes betrayed her emotion. "Thank you," she said as she approached, "for everything. Your hospitality, your care when I was ill." "It was nothing," he replied automatically. "It was everything," she corrected him softly. "A few weeks ago I was a stranger caught in unfortunate circumstances. Now I'm leaving a place that has come to feel more like home than anywhere I've been in years." The words struck Elijah deeply. Home. He'd built this ranch with that intention, creating a place where he and Margaret could raise a family, build a legacy. After her death, it had become merely shelter walls and a roof, a place to exist rather than live. Somehow, in the span of less than 2 weeks, Beatrice had breathed life back into these rooms, these fields, these moments. "It will be here," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Whenever you want to return." She nodded, blinking back tears. "I'll write as soon as we're settled in Helena. It shouldn't be more than a few days. I'll look forward to it." Lawrence approached, clearing his throat. "Beatrice, the sheriff says we should be on our way if we want to reach town before nightfall." "Of course," she replied, composing herself. She turned back to Elijah, extending her hand formally. "Thank you again, Mr. Harlow, for your kindness to us." He took her hand, holding it perhaps a moment longer than propriety dictated. "Safe travels, Miss Newcombe." As the wagon pulled away, Beatrice looked back, raising her hand in a final farewell. Elijah stood watching until the vehicle disappeared from sight, leaving only a cloud of dust hanging in the summer air. The ranch seemed unnaturally quiet in the days that followed. Elijah threw himself into work with renewed vigor, repairing fences, tending livestock, harvesting the small vegetable garden that had flourished under Beatrice's care during her stay. Physical exhaustion kept his mind occupied during the day, but in the evenings, the emptiness of the house seemed to echo with memories of her presence. A week passed, then another. Elijah found himself watching for riders on the horizon, checking with Samuel Wilson when he came by to trade for tools about any mail from Helena. Nothing came. As the 3rd week began, doubt crept in. Perhaps Beatrice had reconsidered once she reached Helena. Perhaps the connection he'd felt had been one-sided, or merely a product of unusual circumstances. Perhaps it was for the best. What did he really have to offer a woman like her, a woman of education and refinement? He was mucking out the stable on a particularly hot afternoon, lost in these gloomy thoughts, when he heard the approach of a rider. Hope flared briefly, then dimmed when he recognized Sheriff Jenkins' mount. "Afternoon, Harlow," the sheriff called, dismounting stiffly. He was holding something in his hand, an envelope. "Sheriff," Elijah nodded, setting aside his pitchfork. "What brings you out this way?" Jenkins held out the envelope. "Mail for you. Been sitting at the post office for a few days, but no one was heading this direction until now." Elijah took the envelope, recognizing the neat, feminine handwriting immediately. "Thank you," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the surge of relief and anticipation that coursed through him. The sheriff studied him for a moment, a knowing look in his weathered face. "Miss Newcombe asked specifically that any letters for you be brought out as soon as possible. Seemed quite concerned that you receive them promptly." Elijah merely nodded, unwilling to discuss the matter further. Jenkins chuckled. "Well, I'll leave you to it then. Good day, Harlow." As soon as the sheriff was out of sight, Elijah tore open the envelope with unsteady hands. "My dear Elijah," the letter began, "I trust this letter finds you well and the ranch thriving under your capable hands. I apologize for the delay in writing. Our arrival in Helena was followed by a whirlwind of activity as Lawrence secured our living arrangements and finalized his business dealings. The mercantile he's invested in is already proving successful, and he's taken to frontier commerce with surprising aptitude for a Boston gentleman. Helena is a fascinating city, full of contrasts, elegant homes standing alongside rough-hewn buildings, opera houses next to saloons. It reminds me that the West is not simply wild, but in the process of becoming something entirely new. I find myself drawn to this state of transformation, this sense of possibility. I have secured a position teaching at the local school, beginning next month. The previous teacher is retiring to return east, and when the school board learned of my educational background, they were eager to offer me the post. It's not what I had initially envisioned for my new life here, but I find myself excited by the prospect of contributing to this growing community. Lawrence has taken rooms for us in a respectable boarding house run by a formidable widow named Mrs. Cartwright, who enforces curfews with military precision and serves the most delicious apple pie I've ever tasted. I think you would appreciate her no-nonsense approach to life, though perhaps not her tendency to interrogate her boarders about their daily activities. I find my thoughts turning often to your ranch, to the peaceful mornings watching the sun rise over the mountains, to the evenings spent in conversation on your porch, even to the injured heifer and the orphaned lamb. How are they faring? Has the heifer regained full use of her leg? Has the lamb grown bolder in exploring its surroundings? I hope you will write when time allows and tell me of these things, of the daily rhythms of life that continue in my absence. And perhaps, when the school term allows a break, you might permit me to visit. I find myself missing the quiet of your land, so different from the constant bustle of even a frontier city like Helena. With warmest regards, Beatrice. Elijah read the letter twice more, absorbing every word, every nuance. Then he carefully folded it and placed it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. That evening, after completing his chores, he sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen, composing his reply by lamplight. His handwriting was less elegant than hers, his words less flowing, but he poured his truth onto the page, telling her of the heifer's recovery, of the lamb's antics, of the summer wildflowers that now carpeted the north pasture in blue and yellow. He told her that, yes, she would be welcome to visit whenever she wished, that the ranch and its owner would be waiting. Over the weeks that followed, more letters arrived, each one a window into Beatrice's new life in Helena and, increasingly, into her heart. She wrote of her students, of the challenges and joys of teaching children from such diverse backgrounds. She described the changing seasons, the social events of the growing city, the books she was reading in her spare time. And between the lines, in the warmth of her inquiries about his well-being, in her detailed remembrances of their time together, In her increasingly personal reflections, Elijah read what she wasn't yet saying directly, that her feelings for him were deepening, just as his were for her. His replies became longer, more open. He found himself sharing thoughts he'd never voiced to another soul, his dreams for the ranch's future, memories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, even cautious reflections on his time with Margaret and the grief that had followed her loss. As summer gave way to autumn, Beatrice wrote that she would have a week's break from teaching during the harvest festival and asked if she might visit the ranch. Elijah's reply was immediate and affirmative. The day of her arrival, he was as nervous as a green colt. He'd spent the previous week cleaning the house from top to bottom, repairing things that had long gone neglected, even planting late-blooming flowers along the front path. Samuel Wilson, who'd brought over a quarter of beef to trade, had watched these preparations with barely concealed amusement. "Never thought I'd see the day," he'd commented, when Elijah Harlow fussed over flowers and curtains. Elijah had merely grunted in response, but he couldn't deny the truth of it. The prospect of Beatrice's visit had awakened something in him, a desire not just to exist, but to create beauty, to build, to look forward rather than back. When her rented buggy finally appeared on the horizon, Elijah felt a flutter of nerves unlike anything he'd experienced in years. He straightened his best shirt, ran a hand through his freshly trimmed hair, and walked out to meet her. Beatrice looked different, somehow more vibrant, more assured. Her hair was styled more simply than when they'd first met, practical for her role as a teacher, but the copper strands still caught the sunlight like burnished gold. She wore a sensible traveling dress in deep blue that complemented her eyes, and when she smiled at him, Elijah felt as though the sun had emerged from behind clouds. "Welcome back," he said, helping her down from the buggy. Her hand in his felt right, like it belonged there. "It's good to be back," she replied, her eyes taking in the ranch, the flowers along the path, the freshly painted porch railing. "You've been busy, I see." "Had some time on my hands," he said with a small smile. "How was the journey?" "Dusty but uneventful," she replied. "And infinitely worth it to see this place again." As he carried her bags into the house, Elijah was acutely aware that this visit was different from her previous stay. Then, she had been a stranded traveler, an unexpected guest. Now, she was here by choice, by invitation, with anticipation on both sides. The week that followed was the happiest Elijah could remember since before Margaret's death. They fell into an easy rhythm, with Beatrice joining him for morning chores, then often reading or writing letters while he attended to the more strenuous ranch work. In the afternoons, they would ride together, Beatrice on Daisy, who seemed as pleased to see her as Elijah had been. Their conversations flowed more freely now, deepened by the months of letters between them. They spoke of their hopes for the future, their views on everything from politics to literature to the development of the Montana Territory. Sometimes they simply enjoyed comfortable silence, watching the sunset from the porch or reading by the fire in the evening. On her fourth night at the ranch, after a particularly pleasant day spent picking late apples from the small orchard behind the house, they sat on the porch watching stars appear in the darkening sky. A comfortable silence had settled between them, broken only by the distant hooting of an owl. "Elijah," Beatrice said finally, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "May I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied, turning to look at her. The faint light from the kitchen window behind them illuminated half her face, leaving the other in shadow. "That day when I asked if I could write to you, you said you'd made a vow never to love again after Margaret died." She paused, gathering courage. "I've respected that, never pressing for more than friendship, but I find myself wondering, Has anything changed? The directness of her question didn't surprise him. It was so characteristic of her, but the vulnerability behind it did. Elijah realized that for all her confidence, for all the warmth in her letters, Beatrice had been careful never to assume his feelings matched hers. "Yes," he said simply. "Everything has changed." He reached for her hand in the darkness, entwining his fingers with hers. "When you asked to hold my hand that night after your fever broke, something inside me shifted. I'd been living half a life, Beatrice, existing but not truly living. You woke me up." Her fingers tightened around his. "I never meant to replace Margaret in your heart," she said softly. "I would never want that." "You haven't," he assured her. "Margaret will always be a part of me, a part of my past, but you—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You've given me a future I never thought I'd have, a reason to look forward rather than back." Beatrice was silent for a long moment, her face turned toward the star-filled sky. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "When James died, I thought that chapter of my life was over. That I'd had my chance at love and it wasn't meant to be. I came west seeking a new beginning, but not this, not you." She turned to face him fully, her eyes shining in the dim light. "I never expected to find someone who understands loss the way you do, who carries it with dignity rather than bitterness. Someone who sees me not as a spinster schoolteacher or a respectable Boston lady, but just as Beatrice." Elijah raised his free hand to gently touch her cheek. "I see you," he said softly. "I've seen you since that day by the creek when you wouldn't let the rain stop you from saving a lamb." The distance between them seemed to diminish of its own accord until he could feel her breath, warm against his face. When their lips met, it was gentle, tentative, a question being asked and answered in the same moment. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and restraint giving way to something new and precious. When they finally parted, Beatrice rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. "I've thought about that since the day I left," she confessed, a smile in her voice. "So have I," Elijah admitted, his hand still cradling her face. "More than I should probably admit." She laughed softly, the sound warming him more than any fire could. "Well, Mr. Harlow, it seems we've been of one mind on the matter." As they sat together under the vast Montana sky, hands intertwined, Elijah felt a sense of peace he'd thought forever lost to him. The vow he'd made in the depths of grief hadn't been broken, it had been transformed, like winter giving way to spring, into something new and full of life. The remainder of Beatrice's visit passed too quickly, each day precious in its simplicity and connection. On her last morning, as Elijah loaded her bags onto the rented buggy, the impending separation weighed heavily on both of them. "It's only until Christmas," Beatrice reminded him, trying to sound cheerful. "The school term ends on December 15th, and Lawrence has already agreed I can spend the holiday here if the invitation still stands." "It does," Elijah assured her, securing the last bag. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. 2 months will pass quickly." Neither of them quite believed it, but the promise of reunion made the parting bearable. Their goodbye kiss was both sweet and sorrowful, filled with things still unsaid, but understood nonetheless. As Beatrice's buggy disappeared down the road, Elijah felt the familiar pang of loss, but it was different now, tinged with hope rather than despair, with anticipation rather than resignation. The weeks that followed were filled with purpose. Elijah's letters to Beatrice detailed his preparations for winter, and, increasingly, his plans for expanding the ranch come spring. Her replies spoke of her growing attachment to her students, of community events in Helena, of her anticipation for Christmas. As December approached, Elijah found himself making improvements to the house that went beyond practical needs: curtains for the windows, a new rocking chair for the porch, even a small piano purchased from a family leaving the territory. When Samuel Wilson commented on these changes, Elijah merely shrugged and said, "Time for some changes around here." But both men knew it was more than that. The Double Cross was becoming a home again, not just a place of work and solitude. When Beatrice arrived for Christmas, the transformation was complete. Elijah had decorated the house with pine boughs and red berries, and a small fir tree stood in the corner of the main room, awaiting the ornaments Beatrice had promised to bring from Helena. Their reunion was joyful, the 2 months of separation serving only to deepen their connection. As they decorated the tree together on Christmas Eve, Elijah found himself watching Beatrice more than the ornaments: the way her face lit up with pleasure, the graceful movement of her hands, the occasional glance she cast his way when she thought he wasn't looking. "What?" she asked, catching him staring. "Nothing," he said, then corrected himself. "Everything. You're beautiful, Beatrice." A blush colored her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "You make me feel beautiful, not just with your words, but with the way you look at me." He stepped closer, taking the ornament from her hands and setting it aside. "I have something for you," he said. "I was going to wait until tomorrow, but—" From his pocket, he withdrew a small box. Beatrice's eyes widened as he opened it to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "She gave it to me before she died, said someday I might find a woman worthy of it." He took a deep breath. "I have. Beatrice Newcombe, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, with all my heart." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Elijah marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment: from grief to healing, from solitude to connection, from a vow made in pain to a promise made in joy. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, plans for their future taking shape in their conversation, Beatrice suddenly laughed. "What is it?" Elijah asked, smiling at the sound. "I was just thinking," she said, her eyes dancing with mirth and tenderness. "How remarkable it is that all of this, you, me, this life we're planning, all began because I asked a stubborn cowboy to hold my hand. Just once." Elijah took her hand in his, the hand that now wore his mother's ring, the hand that had reached out to him when he'd been lost in darkness. "Just once," he agreed, raising it to his lips. "And then forever." Spring came to Montana with its usual capricious nature, one day warm and promising, the next bringing late snow or freezing rain. But by early May, the weather had settled enough for a wedding. The ceremony was small but joyful, held at the ranch with only a handful of guests: Lawrence, of course, Sheriff Jenkins and his wife, Samuel Wilson and his family, a few of Beatrice's colleagues from the Helena school, and the local minister who had ridden out specifically for the occasion. Beatrice wore a dress of pale blue silk that Lawrence had insisted on purchasing for her in Helena, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Elijah, uncomfortable in his best suit but unwilling to dishonor the occasion by dressing otherwise, waited for her on the porch where they had shared their first kiss. When she appeared, walking toward him on Lawrence's arm, Elijah felt his breath catch. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that the vow he'd made 3 years ago had been born of fear, not wisdom. Love was worth the risk. She was worth the risk. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, spoken in clear voices that carried across the ranch yard. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music from Beatrice's piano floating through the open windows of the house that was now truly their home. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the impromptu dance floor that had been created in the yard. "Mrs. Harlow," Elijah said as they swayed together to a slow melody, the title still new and wonderful on his lips. "Are you happy?" Beatrice looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Completely," she assured him. "Though I must admit, I'm looking forward to when our guests depart and we have this place to ourselves." The warmth in her gaze made his pulse quicken. "As am I," he murmured, pulling her closer. Later, much later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Beatrice traced the lines of his face with gentle fingers. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "That I'm the luckiest man in Montana territory," he replied honestly. "That I never thought I'd feel this way again. That I'm grateful every day for a stubborn Boston lady who wouldn't take no for an answer." She laughed quietly, nestling closer to him. "And I'm grateful for a cowboy who learned that some vows are meant to be broken, so that better ones can be made." As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Elijah reflected on the journey that had brought them here from the deepest grief to the highest joy, from a hand held once in comfort to hands joined forever in love. The Double Cross Ranch, once a place of solitude and painful memories, had become a home again filled with laughter and music, with plans for the future, with love that had been found in the most unexpected circumstances. Outside their window, the Montana sky stretched vast and star-filled above the land they both loved, a silent witness to the miracle of second chances and hearts healed by the courage to risk loving again. 5 years later, the Double Cross Ranch had transformed from a place of solitary existence to a thriving family home. The original house had been expanded to accommodate not only Elijah and Beatrice, but also their twin daughters, Rose and Lily, now 3 years old, and the baby boy, Samuel, named after the neighbor who had become a dear friend and who had passed away peacefully the previous winter. Beatrice continued to teach, though now she held classes 3 days a week in the small schoolhouse Elijah had built on their property, serving the children of neighboring ranches who had previously faced long journeys to attend school in town. Her reputation as a dedicated and innovative teacher had spread throughout the region, and families were grateful for the opportunity she provided their children. Elijah had expanded the ranch operations, breeding horses that were becoming known throughout the territory for their strength and intelligence. The orphaned lamb that Beatrice had rescued during that fateful rainstorm had grown into a healthy ewe, the matriarch of a small flock that Beatrice managed with the help of the twins, who delighted in the woolly creatures. On a warm afternoon in June 1883, as Elijah returned from a day of ranch work, he paused to observe the scene before him. Beatrice sat on a blanket in the shade of the large cottonwood tree, little Samuel cradled in her arms while she read aloud from a book of children's stories. The twins sprawled on either side of her, their copper hair so like their mother's shining in the dappled sunlight. The sight filled his heart with a joy so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. 5 years ago, he couldn't have imagined this life, this happiness. He had been so certain that love, once lost, could never be found again, that the risk of such loss was too great to bear a second time. How wrong he had been. How grateful he was for that wrongness. As if sensing his presence, Beatrice looked up and smiled, the same smile that had first begun to thaw his frozen heart. She whispered something to the twins, who immediately jumped up and ran toward him, their small faces alight with excitement. "Papa," Rose called, reaching him first. "You promised to show us the new foal today, did I?" he teased, scooping her up with one arm while extending his other hand to Lily, who clasped it firmly. I seem to recall mentioning it only if you both helped your mother with the laundry this morning. We did. Lily insisted, her blue eyes so like Beatrice's, wide and earnest. Mama said we were the best helpers in all of Montana Territory. Then I suppose I must keep my promise, Elijah conceded with mock seriousness. He looked over their heads to Beatrice, who was now approaching with Samuel. If your mother agrees, that is. How could I possibly object? Beatrice laughed. They've been talking of nothing else all day. Besides, I think Samuel should see his first foal as well, don't you? Together, the family walked to the stable where the new foal, born just 2 days earlier, was staying close to his mother. The girls approached with the careful reverence Elijah had taught them around new animals, their excitement contained but visible in the way they clasped their hands together. "She's beautiful, Papa," Rose whispered as the foal cautiously stretched her neck toward them. "That she is," Elijah agreed, his gaze moving from the foal to his daughters to his wife and infant son. "We're surrounded by beauty, aren't we?" Beatrice met his eyes over the children's heads, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. "Yes," she said softly, "we certainly are." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Elijah and Beatrice sat on the porch as they often did, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Her hand rested in his, a gesture that had become so natural over the years that it was like breathing. "I received a letter from Lawrence today," Beatrice mentioned. "He's thinking of expanding the mercantile to Bozeman. Apparently, Helena is becoming too established for his entrepreneurial spirit." Elijah chuckled. "Your brother has come a long way from the Boston gentleman who arrived at my door. Montana agrees with him." "It agrees with all of us," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. After a comfortable silence, she asked, "Do you ever think about that day, when I asked you to hold my hand?" "Often," he admitted. "It seems such a simple thing in retrospect, but at the time it was everything," she finished for him. "A door opening after being shut for so long." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I made a vow that day too, you know. Not the one I broke about never loving again, but a new one, that I would never take this life for granted." Beatrice turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the first evening stars. "Have I told you today that I love you, Elijah Harlow?" "You have," he smiled, "but I wouldn't object to hearing it again." "I love you," she said simply, "with all my heart." As their lips met in a kiss deepened by years of shared joy and weathered challenges, by the foundation of family they had built together, Elijah marveled once more at the twists of fate that had brought them here. A chance encounter during a storm, a fevered request, a hand held just once, the beginning of a journey neither of them could have foreseen. The cowboy who had sworn never to love again, and the woman brave enough to ask for his hand, had found in each other not just love, but home in this land, in this life they'd created in each other's hearts. And as the stars continued their eternal dance above the Double Cross Ranch, Elijah and Beatrice remained on the porch, hand in hand, grateful for second chances and the courage to embrace them today, tomorrow, and all the days to come.